Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first plenary session of our conference. My name is Stefan Durkon. I'm here the director of the Center for the Study of African Economies, and I am so delighted to see a full room here. It's great that we can be here. You know, the last time we were in this room was in 2019. And we were meant to have, many of you may have been on the receiving end of the 2020 conference, which we had to cancel 3 weeks before its date. We know, of course, what was happening then in March 2020 in this period. Now, it's great that we can all be back, and, you know, however much we've learned to love and a little bit hate Teams and Zoom, and definitely learn to work with it, I mean, there's nothing more fun to actually still interact amongst all of us as academics, as researchers, also people in applied work, in the policy world, at an event like this. So I'm particularly grateful that everybody's decided to come back again. And, you know, we had a very successful number of applicants to come to this conference. So we had, I think, 691 papers were submitted to this conference. I think there's going to be 224 selected and presented here at this event. We know that we are still the largest development economics event focused on Africa anywhere, and it's just great also for us to keep on being able, and we wish we could do more of that, to get people to fund people to come directly from the continent to join us here. So this year we've been able to do that with 32 students and young academics and others from the continent to actually be here, because, you know, it's part of our attempt also to make sure that there is a community of research that is not just happening in Europe or in the UK and in the UK or in the US, but it is, you know, we are in Europe. Sorry, let's not put that statement on. But actually to get people to come and to interact and so on. So I'm particularly grateful for all of them. We also were quite surprised this year, and this clearly where there's a lot of appetite for a conference in person again, that normally we don't have that many more people attending that are not presenting, but this year we had 390 people registering for the conference. So this room is full, but it's going to be busier also tomorrow and the after. So it will be a great occasion to have everybody. So allow me to say a few things as well, and I will end here with also asking for a bit of help from you. So the Center for the Study of African Economies, you know, we may be known to for a lot of you as a conference organizer and organizing this event. Of course, here in Oxford, we are a research center, but it's better understood as an informal network of researchers with a small core function that supports events like this and we're supporting our research. But we are all very much research focused in development economics across different departments here. We do other things as well. Of course, we do some funded research, but we rarely, if ever, do any contract research. We do hopefully also enough on capacity building and other types of activities that we want to do. Now, I mentioned that because we are at the moment also trying to rethink what we do and what we are as a center. So on the app of the conference, there is actually a small survey that wants to ask you what you think the center is, what it should be, what it could be, what it should be less of, what it could be more of, and to actually get a little bit of feedback. So it's on the app, and we would be very much appreciate what we're doing. On top of that, some of you have been roped into focus group discussions and other parts of a more formal review that we're trying to take place, talking to funders, talking to some of the policy environment as well. Because, you know, we've been doing more or less the same thing probably for the last 15, 20 years. Now, there's some good things like this conference, and we find it very hard to actually know once we started doing this, because we've done this definitely since somewhere in the 1990s to have a conference here. But we also ask ourselves, and it's not bad for a group and institution, to ask people that one way or another are also associated in a little bit or more to actually think, what should we do and what should we do better? What can we do better? The app also has space for you to write something. And if there's not enough space or if your thumbs hurt because you do it on your phone, send us an email with ideas of what we should maybe do more of, maybe do less of. And how can we, and I would say especially, be more effective in supporting economics and economic thinking and economic research and maybe economic practice also inside Africa. So that's a gentle request from me to actually ask, please, if you could complete this. There's going to be others that will repeat this as well during the conference, but it would actually be really helpful if we get more feedback. With that, I don't think I have much else to add, rather than to say, enjoy this conference. This is a conference that should be good for the mind and also good for the soul, and just keep on interacting well. And it's great already seeing that people are making new acquaintances and talk to each other and interact. But of course, we also have serious matters, but we actually want to have some high-quality discussions. So with this, I simply pass over to Doug Gollin, and I thank you very much and enjoy the conference. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefan. And again, wonderful to see a crowd like this, in a room like this, and to be having a panel of this kind. So my name is Doug Gollin. I'm a professor of economics here at Oxford. And it's a pleasure for me to organize and moderate this panel. I guess in the spirit of what Stefan was saying, I should give a little bit of background as to what this panel is and how we came to this topic, which is, we have a very loose title of Current Research on Structural Transformation, which is vague enough to cover a lot of different things. But there's a reason for this in part, and more or less at the same moment that we canceled the conference in 2020, so in March of 2020, we were just beginning to kick off a new research program on structural transformation and economic growth. This is a research program that was funded, but was funded then by the organization then known as DFID, the Department for International Development here in the UK, as part of the UK aid effort, now part of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And the idea was to commission and fund and support research on structural transformation and growth. But also to do this, to commission high-quality academic research, but to do a little bit of additional thinking about what structural transformation might mean and how we might understand that topic in an era when research has come with new methods and new data sources, and how we might rethink this topic a little bit. And so for a lot of people, and a lot of policymakers in particular, the phrase structural transformation has always referred very specifically to work on industrialization, on the transformation of economies from agriculture to industry to services. And one of the things that motivated us in putting together this program, which I should say is housed in 5 institutions: Oxford, University of Notre Dame, Groningen Growth and Development Center, the African Center for Economic Transformation in Accra, and the YRISE program at Yale. It's administered by the Center for Economic Policy Research in London. And I'm one of the research directors, along with my colleague Joe Kibosky at Notre Dame. And when we started to put together our plans for STED, it occurred to us that there were a lot of other dimensions of transformation that didn't get talked about nearly as much, and that we thought were interesting to explore further. And clearly there are a lot of big picture questions around industrialization and industrialization policy, but a lot of those veer into sort of philosophical and ideological questions about the role of the state, how much involvement the state should have in making industrial policy. And those are important questions, but not necessarily all of them researchable questions. And for a lot of us working in the broad area of economic growth, there's an additional set of transformations and an additional set of issues that we wanted to bring to the foreground. And so we wanted to move into a broader definition, a broader understanding of structural transformation to encompass things like the movement of people and economic activity from rural locations to urban locations, the movement of the locus of economic activity from the home to the market, shifts in the types of employment between self-employment to wage work, changes in the structure of firms from self-employment and very small enterprise to larger firms. And so we wanted to reach to a broader set of transformations and to think about those through a different lens. So that's where the CSAE program has gone. The CSAE is the unlovely acronym that goes with structural transformation and economic growth. And so we've now funded about 120 research projects with more calls open and on the way. I should send you the CSAE website. These are, to be clear, these are mostly very small research grants. Our median is probably under £25,000. But based on the experience of CSAE, we thought it might be interesting to hold a panel to think a little bit about how some of these issues play out and where the research frontier is around structural transformation on the academic side of things. And so in that spirit, I'm going to introduce today's panel. But sort of what are the questions that are preoccupying policymakers around structural change? What are the questions that academics are working on? How are we using new tools? How are we using new sources of data? Where is the research sitting now? Where do we go next? And so with that as the introduction, I'd like to introduce a panel that's going to help us think through this. Basic structure is going to be, I'm going to ask a couple of questions. We'll do a couple of rounds of questions that I'll ask. And then I just want to open it up for at least half an hour, 40 minutes to questions from the floor. So at some point, if we're getting too long-winded, we'll just kind of cut things off. I think it's more interesting to hear from all of you. So I'm going to introduce the panel in what is not only alphabetical order, but actually works out pretty well to be the seating order here. So I'm really delighted to have Andrew Dabalen here. He's the World Bank's Africa Region Chief Economist. And in that role, he's responsible for providing guidance on strategic priorities and for assuring the quality of the research work that gets done on the region, for developing major region-focused economic studies. In his own work, he's authored papers on poverty and inequality, on poverty measurement, on survey design, and a bunch of other things. So we'll try to push him to straddle the role between somebody who works a lot in conversation with policymakers and somebody who's an academic at heart. Delighted to have him on hand. Next, we've got Clément Imbert. Clément is a professor of economics at the University of Warwick and a research affiliate of lots of organizations. I'm going to miss a few, but Fred and CPR and EUDN, JPAL, I think, as well. And his work covers a range of topics, much of it in development, in environment, in labor, in political economy. And he has a bunch of current projects on rural-urban migration and mobility, and papers on the impact of public investments and social programs. And so somebody who straddles the space between micro and macro in some interesting ways. And then Rachel Ngai is an associate professor of economics at the LSE and a research fellow of CPR. She is also one of the theme leaders of the CSAE program. She's a theme leader on our theme of, I think we call it labor and home production, kind of looking at this at the intersection of work on labor and the movements of economic activity, as I said, between home and market. Her work focuses on structural transformation, labor markets, and housing markets. And she's made broader contributions in the general area of growth theory. So with that introduction, I'm going to start by tossing out my first question to Andrew, I think. So if I may, I want to start with you. You're sitting at the World Bank and in regular contact with policymakers. I think of the four of us, you're clearly the one who's closest to the traditional concerns that people have understood in the context of growth and development and structural change. And so, having given this long introduction about how we'd like to think more broadly about structural transformation, I suspect you might tell us that lots of policymakers still think fundamentally about the role of industrialization and see that as the central question that we should address. So I wonder if you can, is that an accurate assessment? And do you think there's much space in the policy world to broaden that conversation and to talk about other pathways of growth and many other dimensions of change? So over to you.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. It's a pleasure to be back here in person. I think this hasn't been around here for 7 years, which is rather tragic, if you ask me. I've always really liked coming to this conference because it is preeminent, as Clément said, conference on art and development, and it's an area that I care about. So let me first say that if you're not working on economic transformation for Africa, you should. It is the most important thing with development. It's been a wicked problem for a long time. And it remains major concern for policymakers. The amount of economic, or the pace at which economic transformation is. Now, having said that, right now, I don't think economic transformation is on the top list of the policymakers in Africa. These countries are facing really high levels of debt, levels of inflation they have not seen in decades. They're confronting currency depreciation that are really wreaking havoc on their economies. And so right now, they're really concerned about liquidity, solvency, all kinds of insecurities, food. So stability is what is on their mind right now. So economic stability. But in a way, that is connected to issues around structural transformation. And so they are aware of it. So when they talk about structural transformation, they usually have the kind of language they use is diversification. Okay, that's the word. And this is the word that every country uses. They want to diversify the economy. This is small countries. By small, I mean like small island states and also territorially large states with very few people. Right? Those are, you should consider them as small economies. To very large countries. That's what they worry about. And usually what they need is they want to really achieve competitiveness, right, in multiple sectors. It's really about sectoral policies. And in the end, it comes down to we want to be able to actually manufacture things, right? In the end, it could be, okay, we want to achieve competitiveness that will lead us to either exports, final products, or at least enjoying ourselves to global or regional value chains, right? Like some level of value addition, and not just shipping raw materials. And it makes sense to them because, they've inherited basically a very narrow set of products or commodities for earning income, right? These are either, a few agricultural goods, the coffees, the cocoas, the teas, or natural resources, a few minerals or oil and gas, right? So that's what they've inherited, and that brings a lot of volatility to their economies. And so what they really see as the way out of managing volatility is actually the composition of the portfolio of their economy changing, and that means multiple sectoral. Success in multiple sectors. Right? So that's the way they usually think of it, and that's the way. So it's a very traditional way of thinking about it. The other way they come about it is basically the composition of employment, right? And which in the end comes back to the same thing, which is we want more wage, formal employment, less self-employment and informal employment. We want higher skill, higher productivity employment, and less low skill, low productivity employment. And so on and so on, right? So that's the way they think about it. They want the way they think about this transition away from relying on self-employment and more into higher skill, higher productivity workers. So a lot more specialization, division of labor, and so on and so on. Now, what you don't hear about is we want to actually get into services, right? And a lot of people have been talking a lot about the fact that, and it's an observational fact, right? That African countries haven't yet gone through this supposedly traditional process of, moving labor from agriculture to manufacturing or industrialization and then to services. And instead, we see much higher shares of employment in both agriculture and services and very little in manufacturing. And so people have been, making the case that maybe this is a way for African countries to grow. And it's doubtful, actually, for several reasons. One, services is still not really tradable. Yeah, it's true that maybe some services are tradable, but it's still only 1/3 of what is tradable in manufacturing. And two, the thing about manufacturing is that it really improves aggregate productivity of the entire economy. You can't say that about services in general, right? And so it's really not a good idea for African countries to give up on manufacturing. I mean, it's okay for African countries to invest in things like infrastructure, transport, logistics, things that will actually, eventually lead to, better utilization of services. But at this level, I don't think they can be competitive with services. There are some services where they could be competitive because it's a very unique thing to Africa, tourism, where you go and see these, big, magnificent, wildlife. But, some high-end, high-skilled services, it's going to be very difficult for African countries to actually compete on that. Plus, the other reason why they can't be on manufacturers is because they should bid for time. Right now, maybe they're not labor abundant, but the demographic trends are that in fact this is going to be a continent that's going to be very labor abundant. Right? And whatever else you might think about how, AI is going to replace workers or something like that, it's unlikely. I mean, it's not as if we haven't seen major industrial revolutions in the past that people have said would replace labor, and they haven't, right? So there is some sense in which African countries can bid for time, because in fact their demographic advantage might be a competitive advantage in very intensive consumer goods manufacturing and right? But there's one other thing that they don't often talk about, but which they talk about, and that is productivity growth. There's a lot of focus on accumulation. Makes perfect sense, right? So right now it's all about accumulation, build this infrastructure, not accumulate human capital, and so on and so on. But I wish that especially small economies, but all economies, large and small, could focus a lot more about productivity growth, sectoral, economy-wide productivity growth, and not just focus too much on accumulation of production. Right? So that's the way I think African policymakers see this, and they're not entitled, at least in my opinion. Let me stop.
Thank you so very much. That's wonderful. And really a great starting point. Turn next to Rachel. You've written quite a bit about a different dimension of structural transformation, which is the movement in services. And maybe a topic that really blends some work in contemporary macroeconomics with some issues that development economists have been interested in for a long time. I'm thinking of your work on the ways in which growth is linked to changing patterns of women's time use and labor force participation and the role of services in that. So I wonder if maybe you can talk a little bit about what you see as key economic forces that are at work here and what's driving these processes, and maybe how that links with some of the issues that you can't participate.
Thank you, Doug. Yeah. So for me, I've been working with data from the US since the 19th century, in Africa since the 1980s, and China since the 1980s. There are many other forces for female labor force participation. One thing that I think is very important is the process of structural transformation. So when we see the data, the decline of agriculture, especially the decline of family farm, is very important for understanding why in some country female employment rate is falling. So we see it in China, in India, and many other African countries. Whereas the rise of services, especially linked up to the marketization of food production, is very, very important for the increase in the female labor force participation. So let me give a little bit of information about home production. So many of us know what home production I'm referring to, like cooking, cleaning, childcare. So when you think about this, you remember what your mother do or what your wife do, but you don't think of it as very important. But for many years, sociologists and economists were proposing this extended national income, which is basically to measure the value of home production. And luckily, recently, the United States Bureau of Economic Analysis, the organization that published the GDP for the US, has actually now published the value added of home production. And when you look at how important it is, in 1950, the value of home production is about 45% of GDP. And it was on a declining trend to about 22% in 2019. Interestingly, during COVID, there's a rebound. The value of home production increased to 25% of GDP. So this is how important home production is. Now, why is home production particularly important for women? Because according to Time Use survey that is available for about 64 countries, what we see is women still do 3 times more home production than men. And then when you ask women, why aren't you working? In 84 labor force survey, it shows that the main important reason why women is not working is because of the demand of home production. In fact, in many African countries, in my work with Tara Tinkerman, what we've seen is in the African country with Time Use survey, the market hour of women is half of the home production hour that the woman does. So this shows you that home production is a big constraint on women. Now, what is interesting is things change. As I showed you in the data of US, it declined from 45 to 22% in 2019. And that decline is very, very importantly linked to services. Okay, so it's another dimension to Andrew's point about the importance of services. So the service sector gives women the opportunity to outsource the home production. Okay? So sector that provide childcare, provide education, provide cleaning, provide cooking, that help them to release their time for home production. So if you think about this marketization process, it's like creating 2 jobs. Okay, me as the professor and my nanny. If I decided to educate my child myself, there would be 0 job. The minute I decided to become a professor, I hire a nanny, there's 2 jobs. So this is very, very important when you think about this process of organization. Childcare is a very good example. We see it in the spring budget on Wednesday. The new chancellor is pushing for getting people back to work. One of the key components is the childcare subsidy to get women back to work. And there are many other studies in African countries that shows when you provide childcare in Uganda, in Burkina Faso, in Kenya, they show that there's important implication on women's employment base. Now, of course, the development of service sector is one of the important channels for the structural transformation to happen, for the marketization of production. There are 2 other things that is also very important. One is basic infrastructure, meaning like basic water, grid, electricity, transport. Because these are very important for reducing the demand of just cooking. When we compare the time use in Africa today, it's kind of like in the US in the 1920s. You will still need time to last point is, there's non-economic cost, if you want to think about it, the social norm of contribution system. When we compare the North Africa and South Africa, clearly the employment in the South is more than double the North. Now, but what is interesting is, as economists, we cannot change social norm or culture, but what we see from the historical experience of many rich countries is that social norm actually respond to economic forces. Okay? So there are some experimental studies that see how when we change the belief of men on whether their wife are working, the social costs are on that belief when their wife is working, and also the belief on men whether they should be doing the household work. When these experimental studies, when they do changes, find a way to change this belief, it has real impact. So I will stop there.
Thank you. So, again, kind of a really significant switch in focus from sectors and industrialization, thinking about services and thinking about some of the frictions within labor markets and within the home that impede transformation. I'm going to turn next to you, Clément, and your work has touched on some gender issues as well, and impact of programs aiming directly to increase women's labor force participation. But from a kind of a macro labor perspective, to a topic that's sometimes been treated more entirely as a micro topic. And we've also looked at a range of other frictions in labor markets, rural urban migration issues, and some interesting work now looking at the formal, informal margin of employment. So I wonder, how do you think about some of these connections across labor markets and some of the characteristics? I'm curious also if I can get you to say something about how macro and micro literatures and methods are beginning perhaps to come together a little bit on this.
Sure. Thank you for having me. I think I've been here many. Hello? Move closer. Thank you. Thanks, Simon. So, I've been here many years. I think I know half the room. So the other half, I'm very happy to meet you. Okay. So, so it's interesting because just looking back, so I've been doing lots of work on public works in two contexts, in India and Ethiopia. In India, it's the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. In Ethiopia, it's the UPSNP, which is a urban public works program. And this type of programs aim at providing to government separately, directly, to provide new employment opportunities for the poor with often specific objectives by law, as in India, with quota for the community decided to prioritize female-headed household in case of Ethiopia. So an emphasis on developing gender opportunities. And so where I'm coming from is really just looking at what the policies, what are the effects of policies. So just doing policy evaluation in some respects. And when I started the work, I was really involved on the level of micro development, and then I went down a rabbit hole, and when I came out, I was on the macro. That's what the stage is micro. So it's interesting the way it went, because it's just the idea that some programs you look at the effect on the beneficiary, then you think, wait a minute, it's probably going to have an effect on the local economy, the neighborhoods, the communities, and then you broaden the scope, and wait a minute, like if you change, for the case of India, you change seasonal migration, you have an effect on urban labor markets on the other side of the country, or in the case of Addis Ababa, to commuting effects. Even if you have the program in one neighborhood, the whole city will be affected. So in a way, I became macro just by broadening the focus, if you want. And I think it's quite interesting because as you put this, and I'm of course not the only one, I think a lot of the field is moving that way. So I accumulate a lot of empirical evidence with micro data, with I've heard lots of empirical strategies, with lots of fields, experiment, lab in the field. At some point, you've got so much evidence that you turn to sort of the global framework and you say, well, maybe that model that we learned from 40 years ago, maybe it doesn't work as well as this one. So I'll take an example, which is just a serverless labor. Even though you should probably all have heard of it. It goes back to Lewis and Sen, and so that's important people in development. But one definition of serverless labor is if you hire part of the labor force, nothing happens to wages, and nothing happens to output. Okay? So you probably know the model behind this. You might have rigid wages, wages more like number. Just a lot of people are sitting around, either unemployed or in the formal sector, low productivity, self-employment, depending on how. So the problem for me is that I'm working on this public works program. In this public works program, they're exactly doing that sort of experiment. They're hiring part of the workforce, many women among them, and they're, I think, partly the some policymakers might be in the surface labor world, and they don't really expect any effect on wages. But every time I looked at this, wages went up. Wages went up in rural India, in urban India through civil migration, in urban Ethiopia, wages went up, and at least in my papers, private sector employment went down. So suddenly, or I at least, was it's good that economics is making some progress. You don't really expect, Harris-Kodaro model to hold, definitely and completely. But it's just interesting that, of course, you want to be thinking about friction. So another people in this room have been thinking about labor market frictions. So hopefully you want sort of a macro model or model of labor markets that includes, on the one hand, a very stark surplus labor economy, on the other, maybe a fully, perfectly functioning labor markets that somebody is in screening. And in between, you've got all these frictions. And so I think that has been a bit my experience. And of course, I was then very happy to be macro development economists who were precisely developing this type of models that will accommodate the sort of evidence I had was thinking about. And I think I feel like I haven't really connected to my analysis. So one on the gender aspect, I wish I was doing more actually. I think this topic was a strong gender aspect. And it's just very interesting because we're thinking of women in the surplus economy as women as being partly sort of fenced out of the labor market, and so we think about them as a surplus economy in the surplus economy, but not at all, they're very busy. And so that's what's going on in urban Ethiopia. We're seeing this is the women taking up the work, and those women we've already lost all the domestic production, and they were engaged in wage and self-employment. So you don't get this crowd that some people are not doing much, but the women are probably not the right thing. I wanted to connect to the other with another project of mine with Gabriel and Sarah. I realized I haven't started my book. This is the part. So it's Sam Franklin, Guillermo Bebe, and Caroline Martin and Tia for the public works in Ethiopia. And this one for just thinking about rural-urban migration, just thinking about, okay, what's the effects of an influx? So here we think about the positive labor supply shock to an urban labor market. What happens to informality, or the share of the work that's very formal and informal sector? I think if I was to report in this group, you'd probably all think that informality is going up, or many people would. We definitely did with my partner Dabalen and Imbert. And so we were just very interested to see that actually, the share of jobs in the economy, in this urban economy that's formal, is going up after 10. So that's Harris-Kodaro doesn't work in that sense. Okay, what's not holding, what's not verified, is that in the Harris-Kodaro model, you have the wages in the formal sector that are just fixed, they're downward rigid, they just set up. And so you've got some good, I was going to say, public sector jobs in that context. They were thinking of, many of them were public at the time. Basically, these formal sector jobs, they are the jobs everybody wants, and people are sort of sitting around, queuing, taking this as a luxury. Well, that's not what we see at all. So we're looking at parts of Brazil, not the richest part of Brazil. And we're seeing that the wages actually are just downward jobs in the formal and informal sector, and that formal sector jobs are being created in those places, which is sort of sounds like good news. At least we're very happy and we're thinking of giving this good news to everyone before I heard you, because actually it's a lot of service sector jobs. So it's formal jobs, but it's a lot of service sector jobs, and so these economies are growing, but maybe not in a way that we see really good.
Great, thanks. So that's one round. I'm going to do another round here. And let me come back to you with a question, I guess, which is, how do you see, or do you see some of these broader issues around gender, around the functioning and frictions of the labor markets, around issues like informality, even climate change? These are things that weren't part of the conversation around macro policies even a decade ago. And how are those capturing the attention of policymakers and in the policy space? Is this something that's really changed the discourse, or is it still something that's seen as outside the main stream of ideas and policy concerns?
Okay. Again, it's kind of strange that I should be an advocate for macroeconomics here. I'm sure there are a lot of macroeconomists here who think about this. But having, so the advantage of being in this role is that obviously I've been doing a lot of this work from the micro end, and now I get to talk to a lot of macroeconomists about these issues. But I think the main point is that we should actually welcome the idea of macroeconomics taking into account these long neglected issues of gender, informality, and climate change. And the reason I say that is because, at a minimum, at least it extends this long-held idea that macroeconomics is really about micro foundations of macro, right? Which typically have tended to be basically this typical household that basically informs the macroeconomics of every country. But more seriously, I think there are two reasons why this matters, right? One is measurement. So at least on measurement, it matters a great deal. And Rachel had talked a little bit about that. For example, what's the size of the economy? If you actually don't account for, this non-monetized sector of your population, women's work, or non-market part of the economy, or even the informal sector. If you don't account for those, you miss completely the size of the economy. And a lot of countries for a long, long time didn't actually account for even the informal sector. Forget about the non-monetized work that women do. So they didn't account for it, and so they didn't completely underestimate the size of the economies. Right? The second thing we miss in terms of measurement is basically what's your tax base and what's the fiscal potential of your economy. Right? We miss that as well, especially since you don't really monitor take account of a whole lot of workers and businesses that are involved. Some of which are relatively successful and are private, right? And could in principle be paying taxes. The third thing you miss is the aggregate productivity of your economy, right? In many ways, when you don't account for the work that in many ways, when you actually don't account for occupational distribution of your workforce, for example, where women are, where men are, then it's a form of misallocation. And so you actually completely miss the aggregate productivity, or you find whatever you measure is completely distorted, because that is a misallocated time in the economy. Right? And then, just on one issue about climate change, in principle, climate change in the future should be affecting the volatility of your growth and the economy, right? So your focus areas are basically going to be much wider. And so all these things, if you don't take them into consideration, will affect the measurement in general. And if you can't measure some things, you probably won't be able to do really good policy. And that's where I'm coming to. So there's also the policy side, right? So say, for example, right now, with this available, right? Let's say inflation that they haven't seen it yet. And you're going to use this blunt instrument, right, which is the interest rate hikes. So that's what you're going to use. So the whole idea is to use it as a monetary, transmission mechanism that will actually raise the cost of capital and therefore, lower investments and economic activity and pull the economy down. But if, very small fraction or share of the economy is actually linked to the banking sector, right, and the rest are not, then there are a whole lot of things that you actually wouldn't be able to affect, right? And so in that sense, then the structural part of the economy becomes, putting a premium on structural reforms becomes important, right? Because you might still not be able to actually control inflation by using this management. And in a way, you kind of miss out on those things, right? Second, in terms of policy, thinking about climate change, a lot of how people are going to respond to climate change is going to be things, there's a lot we don't know about climate change, right? But what we know is that a whole lot of how people are going to react to or respond to climate change is going to depend on the technologies that are going to come in the future and the prices of those technologies, right? And those are things that right now I don't think that we know how to model, in our macroeconomic policies, right? So I think thinking about those things and trying to come up with models for how to think about those things and framework also does matter, right? And then finally, I'm going to say, again, continuing on this issue around climate change and why the market, it's really important to think about it. What climate change is going to do, or at least the actions that we have to take, especially for African countries, the premium is going to be on adaptation, right? There are very few countries in Africa that really can contribute, measurably and significantly to emissions reduction, right? It's hardly anything. So what really is a problem for them is the fact that they are actually victims, they're really vulnerable to the ravages of climate change, and so they need to adapt, right? In game theoretic terms, that is first order kind of dominant strategy, right? To them. But that increases the cost of development, right? Naturally, right? And because it increases the cost of development, you have to think about, okay, how do you finance this stuff? What's the fiscal regime that we need to adopt to do this? It has a lot of implications about public investment management, right? About what kinds of fiscal policies should have, and so on and so on, right? So it's really, really important for macroeconomists to think about this. And so those of us who come from the microeconomic side try to convince them this is important and they should be taken seriously. Thank you.
Thanks. So, Rachel, back to you. So your work has led you to dig into a lot of institutional details. I'm thinking of your work on the Hukou system in China. I'm thinking of some of your work on gender and structural transformation. You've dug deeply into details and how leisure is defined, how work is measured. And these seem like fairly new kinds of things for macroeconomists to be thinking about in some ways. Maybe a trend not only towards using microdata in macro, but even in some cases qualitative qualitative methods to inform macro models. And I guess I just wanted to ask how you think the academic macro community has been adjusted and how these methods are perceived.
It's actually very interesting. The first time I hear about time use and production is when I was a PhD student in the 90s, some time ago. So in the 90s, there was actually a popular way of using to understand macroeconomy, especially the fluctuation impulse response, very persistent, because home production at that time is think of it is a substitute to the GDP, and therefore it has responses. So if you want to understand the impact of taxation on aggregated supply, you want to understand what's the impact of measured GDP. So people, macroeconomists have used it. This is my type of literature, but also in understanding cross-country and GDP differences by thinking about different countries can have impact on home production. But those were the day, I remember they just say, oh, 1/3 of the time on home production, 1/3 leisure, and 1/3 market. And that is about it. So the key problem is because there is no, comparable time use survey across many countries, and also there are very few countries that has a long time series. So you need to research hard. That's why it wasn't the mainstream. But recently, we have seen there's a lot of effort to harmonize the time survey. We see the European Manhattans, the international one, the ECAS, which is first published by the United Nations in 2005. And as I just mentioned, the value of home production is also very important, because that helps you to understand about productivity of home production, talking about productivity. So the only one that I can think of is the United States that just published for the past few years on the value of home production. So I believe when these data become more available, people will take this more seriously. So when I write a paper that I have leisure, and I check very carefully to distinguish leisure is not the same as home production. You want your child clean, but you don't enjoy changing nappy. But leisure, you watch TV, you don't want to hire someone to watch the TV for you. So there's a very clear difference between leisure and home production. But they speak to both about productivity and also both about welfare. So as a macroeconomist, if you want to understand welfare, like recently a PhD student tried to understand how has welfare in the United States changed since the 1960s, and he was only looking at the consumption. Well, consumption is purchase consumption. So people spend in the market. I just showed you from 1950 to 2019, home production set a straight a lot. So a lot of these have become purchase. So if you ignore that dimension, you will overstate it. And similarly, leisure has gone up a lot. So if you don't include leisure, you will underestimate welfare. So these are very important. Another thing that time use study really helped us, they also related to the skill dimension of women. So if you think about, in many countries, we keep talking about giving education to women. So we have, in many countries, women's skill is going up. I think Korea and Japan, the women there are highly educated. But very often, the minute that they have a child, they withdraw from the labor force. Yet the only set of countries still have this sort of informed labor force participation, that during childbirth it just drops substantially. And what happened? Whatever that she is, if she's a lawyer, she's a professor, those skills are lost. So they acquire the skill, but they couldn't bring it to the productivity. Instead, they become doing jobs that they could have hire someone who doesn't have a PhD or who doesn't have a law degree to do it for them. We all experienced this during the COVID time. When I have to start cleaning toilets, doing the ironing, and doing the homeschooling, I cannot apply my economics knowledge. You see, the core thing about Alan Smith is about specialization. That is where we gain. That's where we can talk about productive job. See, these educated women, they help that because we don't have that chance to outsource. So I think these are very important macro questions on this allocation. If you really want to understand this allocation, the time use is going to be a big chunk of it. Because even now, in many countries, home production hour is as big as market hours. So it's very important to understand, for many important macro topics. So I'm looking forward how the availability of data on time use, and hopefully more countries will compute the value of home production, and we can really talk about productivity and actual growth in welfare.
Thanks. I'm conscious that I want to get things opened up for questions, so Clément, I'm going to toss this to you with a to urge you to give a brief answer, which is really just to touch on the ways in which new methods and to some extent new data have crept in. So you've got some really interesting work that combines RCTs with structural modeling. I think that as we think about the meaning of micro and macro data, also think about the meaning of micro-macro methods and how this is playing out. So I wonder if you just comment on that.
The thing is that I don't have to actually present the model. Okay, so maybe then briefly my experience has been a very happy one. Recently, with this urban public works evaluation in Ethiopia, because I've been lucky to have professor, partly with the World Bank support, have been collecting incredible amount of data and extremely detailed data on commuting patterns and where people work within the city and how much they live in different parts of the city. This type of data is actually very rarely available. And we combine this data with also an RCT in the sense that the program was randomly rolled out across different neighborhoods, which is also, I think, definitely coming from the macro development issue that is essentially definitely being pushed by the Warwick because that's the funding of the program. And then we've combined this with a model that, so it's not quite macro, but it comes from trade and this model of spatial equilibrium. And so basically, in my experience, I think that the sort of traditionally model-heavy part of the economics literature has now developed models that even macroeconomics because it means that we can understand and also that can be estimated relatively simply using methods that we use at a very micro level, like the significance of distributed particles. And so that's the macroeconomics coming to us on that. And then we were in a situation where we had actually more data than most other projects looking at urban spatial equilibrium. So it was really so
maybe we should stop there. Just leave it as a win-win. It's always a nice place to
that's a good chat.
I think what we should do is, people have been sitting very patiently, and it's at the end of the day, and lots of people have already have gotten off planes this morning or yesterday. So I'd like just to open things up for a cluster of questions, and if we can keep questions brief, then we can get more of them in. Let me take 3 or 4. I think there are a couple of mics that are going to be sort of roaming mics, and so I see a hand up. So I see one down here, and back. Let's start with the lady here, and that one, and I see one just below.
Thank you. On Rachel, in the African sector, home production is a historical social construction as a role of a woman, and therefore it should not be there. And if a woman leaves her home to go look for work, then it comes to social truancy or an impossible woman who cannot sit still. If the woman works, the decision making on the money is the husband who has to decide on the money. This is the traditional setup. Although it's with the new kind of change where more girls are going to school, more girls are now in the labor market, this is likely to change. In your work, if you focus in Africa, the court cases today we have is where women are getting divorced and they're gone to the court with the husband and they're looking for the support. The court rules that because the woman did not contribute to the income for building the asset, then she has no rights to the property. That the rulings are becoming fast and furious. In this case, and it's the disadvantage to women who are in the non-market kind of production. But in reference as an economist, I look at Robert Lucas with his Nobel Prize in 1988, and Rita Lucas had to get a portion of his Nobel winning. So what are the challenges in the area of research, especially in addressing some of these social constructions?
Thank you. My name is directed to Andrew. Thank you so much for the presentation. My question is about if we're talking about African economies and the government's thinking about getting a portion of the express in the competition, right, to achieve competitiveness in market sectors, and then you're saying for African countries, we need to think more about venturing into manufacturing, right? And of course, Rich has mentioned something about specialization as one area. But my question is, can we discuss development of African countries in a bubble when I believe one of the biggest challenges is the local connections that African countries have. So how can we move for such a challenge, for instance, for African economies? Because we can talk about and can debate taking space in manufacturing, but in value chain, global chain, but then they are gatekeepers and to these economies. And that's why you see we're having issues of debts and the like. So, to you, what do you say about that?
I have a question just beyond. Yep. And then there's one way up in the back there. I want to make sure we get to the back.
So this question, I think, is mostly for Andrew, although a little bit for Clément, and goes to something that Doug said, which started with this idea that structural transformation had a lot of ideology in it. And I'm wondering in this idea that we need, so I agree with Andrew that productivity change is really important, but I guess having estimated productivity change in the industrial sector in a number of African countries, I haven't seen it. And I know we're not very good at estimating productivity change in the service sector, but I guess I'm wondering whether the focusing on industries is doubling down on something that hasn't been working, and we don't know if the service sector can work, but I guess I'm not convinced it's any worse.
Thank you. My name is Peter Bosse from East University of London. My goals to Andrew, I agree very much with you about the focus of African countries currently on stabilization, achieving stability, high inflation. So now the interest is to ensure stability. That is very much true. But I think until we stop this with structural transformation, this vicious cycle will continue. And I would urge you and the IMF, as African countries seek IMF support for bailouts and many others. I think you should push forward. Do both. Ensure that there is structural transformation. Otherwise, this vicious cycle of instability will continue to hurt African countries. Thank you.
See, I have. We can give you another time. So, one more question here, and then we'll give the panelists a chance, and we'll take another round.
Thank you. I don't really know yet if it's a question or a comment. When I was listening to the first story, my name is Zaynes. I am coming from Cameroon University, where I completed 2 school. So my question is linked to the what Mr. Evans said and what Mrs. Rusher said. So it links the 2 ideas. So I'm really interested by the home production issue, being a woman in a country where women are behaving based on the traditional division of labor, like women are the one in charge of the care of children and everything. We were talking about moving from less productive areas to more productive. But when I listen to the division of labor that can be obtained by a woman with an economic background, working on what she gained, and the job of nanny generated by that decision. My issue is in my country specifically, the government is the one in charge of the most, handling the most parts of the labor, which means the wages are quite subsistent but low. Those women cannot be able to give good salaries to nannies. And at the same time, the women deciding to hire nannies are judged by the social norms, that they are not good women, they are not doing their jobs, and if the child turns bad, it's their fault. So my issue is, how will you defend that idea in such African economies in front of the governments, which are the one that can be finance the public nanny systems with good salaries, and at the same time giving advices to husbands for normal households to send their asset that they are working to them. Thank you.
Let me turn things over to each of the panelists to answer as much or as little as you want. So this is a great opportunity. One of the nice things about asking questions in clusters is that not everything has to get answered by everybody. So why don't each of you be selected, and when we start closer to me with Rachel, and then we'll communication.
Okay, I'm trying to be quick. So, on my work of looking at US data during the whole 19th century, I think it's very typical for developing countries as well. What is the family structure? It first started with the family enterprise in the 19th century, where usually the husband owned the farm and the woman worked on the farm without getting paid. Okay? So the woman is working for the market, and that is the female labor force participation in many of today's African countries. Half the women's labor force participation is in the unpaid family work, meaning they are basically hired by husband, but they don't get paid. Now, when family farm disappear, or any of these family businesses disappear, women, in order to keep working, they will have to be home. Okay? And that is the problem. Okay? So what do you do now? When you are working on the farm, you can look after your child. So now you have to go out. So what we see in some of the studies, say in Africa, is that self-employed women very often have to bring their child to work. And as a result, they earn less profit than self-employed men. So many of the policy that various organizations doing is trying to say set up mobile childcare centers, or that is about changing the belief of men believing that men can do the household work and women can go out to work. Now, how do we convince government? Social norm is something very, very slow to change. But luckily, over the last 150 years history of the United States, we do see a change. I think we just have to be very open and tell them to look. When we look at the successful case of Scandinavia, where the government actually stepped in trying to subsidize childcare, okay? And that really made a big impact on female employment. And as we see on Wednesday, even UK now is trying to provide more childcare to that dimension. So I think it's something challenging, but when we educate women, we want them to follow their talents, to do things that they are good at. Of course, there are women also very good at childcare, and so they can work at childcare center where there's benefit of economy of scale, market productivity can increase. It's not like we have different talents and everyone can allocate according to their talents. But if the social norm or whatever like Kuzma would say, the old custom is holding back the process of social transformation, then we have the issue of consolidation and the sanction of the labor force, which made women really suffer because there's no point of getting all this education if the minute you decide to have a family, you have to make that choice. I thought
I don't think it can be as a racial this I think most of the questions are Andrew, so I'm going to be very brief and
That's it?
yeah.
Okay. Actually, on Scholastica's question, and following up on Rachel, I'm going to actually recommend, okay, so it's not all bleak. I'm going to recommend that you pick up what I would probably talk about, which is there's a report that Warwick puts up on women, business, and law. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. I think if you're not, you should check it. It's really trying to actually monitor and track progress that the countries in the world are making in bridging the gaps between men and women. And what you will find in that report, the latest, is that African countries made the most progress. Now, the index for African countries has low base, but they have made the most progress in recent years. And what you'll see is the kinds of things they talk about is where a lot of the progress has been made, which is basically reforming laws and policies that actually discriminate against women in the labor market, in terms of marriage and divorce laws, equalizing rights around that, issues around gender violence, laws around gender violence, and access to credit and so on and so on. So there's a whole range of policies and laws in which these African countries have actually made progress. Now, there's a lot of distance to cover in order to be able to catch up with where the rest of the world is, but there is a lot of progress that has been made. So that's that. Now, on the question around stability versus productivity. So that, I think it's important to remember that this is, you cannot have a whole lot of things happen, especially structural transformation, economic transformation, structural change, without macro stability. I think that's something we should remember, right? A lot of countries in Africa have kind of bought into that position the last 2 decades, and that is a it was an incredible victory, I think, for the continent, right? Because before that, there was just a lot of mismanagement and a lot of lack of commitment to macro stability, and so what we had was decades, a lost decade, and a lot of people have talked a lot about that. And so, subsequently, the reforms that have followed that, I think a lot of policymakers have believed, in fact, that is essential, right? It's a foundation for doing a lot of things. And that's what a lot of the policy, so the gentleman from Ghana, that's what a lot of the policies that the World Bank and IMF actually propose about, which is establish macro stability because that gives you the space to actually do structural reforms. And structural reforms in the end is what is going to get to economic transformation, right? So there's no inconsistency on Congress in that sense. But I want to come back to the question around, whether we can. I mean, what will it take? Is it realistic to actually have competitiveness and so on? And here, what I would say is there are two things that none of this is going to be easy, right? I think it's really important to remember that, right? It's going to take a while, but there are two things that will be important for us to watch in terms of how this will evolve. One is, first of all, how committed these African countries are to this continental right? The whole idea of having these types of initiatives is to actually diversify the sources of their trading partners. Right? As they are now, African countries are just too small. They don't have the scale, right? And so it's very hard to actually get entry of firms, innovation, competitiveness. But if you actually enlarge the size of the market, which is what the free trade area is supposed to do, okay, then it is possible to see that in fact, companies that are not, right now the difficulty is that a lot of these countries produce the same thing, right? It's hard for Kenya to trade with Ethiopia really deeply when they are both producing mostly coffee, right? So it's just that kind of time, right? Or for that matter, Uganda, which is also major producer of coffee, or Rwanda, and so on, right? Everyone is producing coffee in that area. So it's hard to trade. But you can imagine it, in fact, over time, if you have a market of about 300 million people, there will be other needs that, there is just something that is important about size, right? You can imagine that, in fact, a lot of other companies will come in to solve problems that these 300 million people are facing that has nothing to do with drinking coffee, right? So that is the hope, and that is the kind of the conjecture that a lot of these guys face. And so that is, but in the process of doing that, they are going to have to invest in a lot of things: skills, infrastructure, corridors, right? All those things have to be done in order to be able to actually lower the cost of trade and so on. Without that, it won't happen. Now, are services better? Okay, so these are longer debate, but here's what I would say: 2/3 of global trade is still manufacturing. Okay? That tells you a lot. Right? There is a ceiling to how tradable services are. Now I know that we have cloud computing coming up, there's all this stuff about ICT. There's a lot of things that are promising about how you can be sitting in Kenya and providing services to people in the US or anywhere else in the world and so on and so on. But there is actually a ceiling to this kind of trade, right? The thing that makes manufacturing special is that it uses scale, right? That services have. And as I mentioned before, it also really raises the overall productivity of the entire, every sector, including the ones that provide services, requires manufacturing. They need the machines and the technologies in order to be able to have, more capital per worker in order to be able to raise the product, right? So that's really essential, and that's what makes it. That's what makes it special. And on the measurement of productivity, I'd be happy to talk to you about it because we have all kinds of measurement issues.
I think we should take a couple more questions, but I haven't had any from this side of the room. I see a few hands. Ray's got one up there. I can't resist exercising chair's prerogative to say that while manufacturing may make up a lot of trade is not the same as the economy. Right? There's a lot of the economy that productivity growth and services for the domestic market should be reduced. Anyway, so a hand up there, and then one in the middle right here.
So I have one question for Rachel and one for Andrew. Rachel, I have been discussing with you, friends and colleagues, about the relationship to work and the professional life after COVID. So, what do you think COVID had in terms of impact, in terms of bringing food production to the market? Because a lot of people are considering actually giving up a little bit of like the professional goals to spend time raising your kids. So how do you see that? Now to add to you mentioned that policymakers are actually very much interested in building industrial base in Sub-Saharan Africa. So there was like this view in some of our institutions, including Warwick, about promoting leapfrogging, right? The service sector. So I'm wondering if is your view that we should, in a very provocative way, think about a reverse leapfrogging, in the sense that many of sub-Saharan African countries, and then we can think about services. Is it something that can I frame what we do in that context in terms of kind of
Sorry, leapfrogging into what?
Into services.
Question
and
is
also
keeps coming back.
this is not the view of the talk, and then
One here, and I'll take one more from this side. Ray, you can figure out which hand to. Please go ahead. Okay. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Anusha, and my question is for Richard. So in the African context, what we have seen over the years is, first of all, there are so many policies and approaches by the government and international institutions which encourage more female labor participation. After that, we again see a lot of policies that focus on giving more access to services like childcare and so on for women. But what I think is that the targets of these policies are always about increasing female participation in the labor market, or about giving them more opportunities or more services which will help them, contribute more in the labor market. But what are your thoughts on why the targets of these policies are never about incentivizing men to contribute more to home production?
Look, the current students cases in the US. Could it be that the quest for structural transformation is elusive for most developing countries because of the ideological mutations or evolution of the definitions of structural transformation? In other words, we have more intensification, diversification, and also because of some of the policies in the developed economies, and also because of the valuable advice of the experts. In other words, we're not having the structural solution because some of our research has avoided some of those issues. Thank you.
And last one here.
Thanks very much. My name is Rachel Leon. I'm a doctoral student in Dart's department. I guess my main question is for Andrew, but potentially everyone. I guess it's probably clear that to increase productivity, you have to have investment from the state. And when you're facing a debt crisis, I don't know, we all know that macroeconomic stability is important, but how do you weigh up the need to have stated investment in economies to drive productivity growth, whether it's providing services for women into the market, whether it's open trade corridors, that just does seem to require money. And how do you do that alongside reducing debt? And is the solution somewhere about having global policing around corruption and money flows out of Africa?
Great. So we have a challenge, which is to answer all of these questions in, let's say, 3 minutes. I don't want to do too much on people's time, but let's just, why don't we do this briefly, and again, I'll just, Rachel, Clément has said a model for brevity.
Okay, so on COVID, COVID is a disaster. So from the ILO publication, we see that after COVID, many people withdraw from the labor force, and the key is the woman. Okay, so the ending of COVID was a great hope for many. Now, but what we learned from COVID is what I said earlier on. It just messed up the specialization completely. When you think about, women have to do all these things at home, and the time you study, you say that it's the mother will do much more than the father and profile at home. The child will go to the mother to ask for the homework rather than the father. So it's something that is a very important thing that we finally get out of it. But there's one good thing, kind of, which is that the COVID has encouraged some companies to allow working from home. So that might help some women in terms of balancing their lives. Now let me go back to the question about Africa and policy about focusing, increasing females' labor force participation in these rather than increase men. So you're completely right. Men, as I mentioned earlier on, women still on average do 3 times more than men, and only Norway that we see equality basically. But that sends hope. That means with these kind of changes over time, eventually men will break the barrier and start to do more household work. And we see that in the American Time survey. The home production hour of men is actually rising. So it's something that with this policy, the hope is eventually that African men will also realize that they could also do the household work. When mother really is acquiring their professional job or whatever they're specializing. So that is hope.
Those that message. I wanted to start by mentioning. I'm surprised that it's not surprised that there are very important issues, but I think management is probably could have come up with during this discussion. I've just started working on it, and I think Africa has an important role to play mitigating climate change because of forests, and there's a lot of deforestation happening. Actually, the country where most of the deforestation is happening now, partly because so much has happened elsewhere. And so it's a positive message from us. And so right now, it's just to think that the structural transformation is actually the population need low agricultural productivity places that are close to forests that might actually be less deforestation.
I just wanted to talk about it. I think if you want to save the planet, which we all care about, we want to, then economic transformation in Africa, which relieves the pressure of these poor people relying too much on wood for energy or charcoal or whatever it is going to be really, really important. So I think, I totally agree with you on that. Now, quickly, can we leapfrog? Probably unlikely, right? And the reason why it's unlikely is because just think about the places where maybe 75% of economic activity is in services, Europe, North America, right? What do they have in common? Very high levels of per capita income, right? High levels of skill and productivity, lots of innovation, very easy to form firms, right? I mean, if you take a list of what these countries have in common, none of the African countries are probably able to be at that. They are at the frontier. Those countries are at the frontier of technological innovation. That's why they can do this, right? African countries are not at the frontier of technological innovation, right? There are few, there are really high-skilled people in Africa, but there is a very small fraction of the population, right? So it's very unlikely that you can leapfrog. It's just not going to happen unless you really improve your skills, the skill set, productivity levels. But all that requires, getting economic transformation going at some point, right? So you can't easily do that. Because I'm aware that there is a time constraint here. I'll answer the question on the role of the state. So it's true that these countries are under pressure, they have a debt crisis. But again, as Doug said, we really need to think about, it's time for Africans to think about the role of the state. They can't do everything, right? In fact, what has happened because of the debt crisis, what has happened is that public investments have collapsed, right? FDI has collapsed. So all investments have declined, but particularly public investments, which has been the major driver of growth in the last 2 or so decades now. Right? At least the major driver. So it's time to really rebalance these things into one is perhaps to start thinking about, again, I keep coming back, structural reforms that actually attract private investments, allow for the entry of firms, particularly FDI and big firms to enter the market, and two, to really think about what it is that you want to do with public investments, the little that is left. Okay? Be very selective. So you want to invest in high value, high return, high quality investments. So that's the way you want, and a lot of that has to do with investing in human capital, secondary education, skill formation, and so on and so on, right? So that's important for these countries to be able to actually increase the product. Yeah.
I will not try to wrap things up and summarize them. I think one of the only takeaway I'd ask you to end up with is within the macro development community, there's starting to be space for lots of different conversations. A lot of the academic work in macro development, as you've heard, is extending into areas that are not fiscal policy and monetary policy, but are looking at frictions much more generally. Reality keeps yanking us back hard into talking about things like the role of the state and perhaps about fiscal and monetary policy after all, and macro stability. So, but I think it's for those of you who took macro, probably not as long ago as I did, but who took it some time ago, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. Maybe I just leave it at that and say, please tune in, ask hard questions, think about macro implications of micro things, and think about micro implications of macro work. And on that, I'd just like to thank the panelists.